So let's look at briefly Postman. It will be very brief, this, because we're just going to be using it throughout the rest of the day. So you'll get a fairly good feel for Postman. If you've already got an HTTP debugging tool that you use already, use that instead. This is not something you have to use. This is just my personal favorite. And what this essentially lets you do is make HTTP requests without having to go write code. You just put things in the UI and you hit the button and it does it. You can do GET requests in a browser, well, unless you need to specify request headers. But simple GET requests, you can just type the URL into a browser and it will do it. I'll show you that in a moment. But anything beyond that, if you need to specify headers, well, primarily headers for a request, but if you need to do a post or a put or a delete, you can do it in a browser by writing some HTML and loading the HTML file and submitting the form, and it's just a pain. So these sort of tools allow you to test the whole range of the environment with request headers and response headers and bodies and all of that kind of stuff. And essentially, it's specifically designed for testing RESTful APIs. So you can get it from, there's a URL at the bottom there, getpostman.com. It's actually a Chrome plugin. So you do need Google Chrome installed in order to install this. Getpostman.com will just redirect you off into the Chrome store, basically. Actually, it's not a plugin, it's a Chrome application, is what it is. So it runs as a separate, discrete window, puts an icon in the start menu and so on, but essentially you're running an instance of Chrome. So what Postman essentially lets you do is there's various areas of the UI. There's an area that looks kind of like a web browser at the top that you can just type in a URL and you can type in the parameters, or there's UI to let you enter the query string parameters if you wish. But the difference is, notice in a browser you don't have a thing that says, do you want to do a get or a delete or a post or a put? You're just doing a get all the time. So the nice thing about this is you can say, I want to do, what type of operation is it that I'm trying to do? There's also UI to let you interact with and define what the request headers are that you're sending. There's drop-down lists of all the standard ones, and you can type in custom ones and so on and provide the values. There's also bulk edit windows that you can pop up a little UI and just paste a whole bunch of stuff in there if you don't want to go through and type them all in. And then there's also an area that lets you deal with the body. And in this case, I'm just taking a look at the raw view. It can either be just a raw view of the data, or it can interpret and format the data and so on. Once you're done, you simply hit the send button, and there's a couple of areas of note. You know, there's an area that shows you the status that came back from the call, which is obviously we now know is an important thing. That's our primary mechanism for figuring out did it work or not. It'll tell us how long the call took. We can look at the headers that came back and examine those headers in the UI, and we can look at the response body. Again, either we can look at the raw data, or the pretty view kind of formats it and indents it and stuff like that for us to view and so on. Also, Postman lets you make what it calls collections. So these are kind of like little projects. So if you're designing a bunch of tests for a particular web service, you can create a collection and then put the tests within that collection, which just gives you a great way of letting you organize things. And the nice thing about it is you can then export that collection to a JSON file and version control it and share it with other people and so on, so you can maintain your Postman tests externally and treat them as source code. Also, what you will find is that optionally, you can create an account with Postman, or you can log in with a Google ID. I log in with a Google ID, and if you do that, it will synchronize all of your tests through the Google Cloud. So, you know, I go home and open up Postman on my home PC, and there's all my tests. So it's a very nice environment. It's basically free. There is a paid version as well. I think it's quite expensive, but I think it has a whole bunch of team functionality as well if you want to get a paid subscription for it. But I don't find it necessary. I find the free version does everything I need. And I just want to show you a simple example of A, using Postman, and B, a couple of just HTTP transactions so that we've seen some stuff happening. So what I'm going to do is, so here's Postman. Let's just do about the simplest thing there is to do. Let's just say, here's where we're forming our request. Okay, so this is the request section up here with authorization. If we are doing authorization, you can plug in various kinds of authorization. Here's where we can deal with our headers. Here's the body of the request that we're sending, and so on. So the basics are, let's just give it a URL and see what happens. So let's say, let's just go to google.com with a GET request. This is really no different to typing this thing into a browser. I'm just making an HTTP request to a URL, and we get back a response. Yeah, in a browser, this is the HTML that came back from that Google request. So we made the request in the request section. We did a GET to that URL. We didn't pass any headers. We got a response back. There's the response body. We're looking at it. It realized it was XML and formatted it for us. If we wish, we can just look at the actual raw data itself. We can look at any cookies that came back. No, Google didn't send any cookies back to us at this point. We can look at any headers that came back. What have we got here? Cache control, private, max age equals 0. That's Google saying to the client, please don't cache this. Okay, ask me again if you want it. Content type is text HTML. The date that it was sent, when it expires, -1 immediately, again, is another way of saying don't cache this. Of course, there's nothing to stop something caching it, but the server is saying this is not cacheable content. Whether it's subsequently cached or not is up to you, and so on. So there's some headers that came back. Let's look at something a little bit more interesting. Let's see what happens if we make a mistake. So let's go to google.com/junk. Okay, which is not a valid URL. And again, now the data we got back is, let's look at the body. Oh, we did get a body back. Okay, it sent us a little HTML page saying that's an error. Okay, so it sent us a little bit of viewable HTML that said that's what was going on. But more importantly, it told us 404 not found. That's the important thing. That's what our application should be looking at to say, didn't work. Okay, and it also told us it took 65 milliseconds to make the call. Let's move on and look at something a little bit more realistic and a little bit more in line with what we're going to be doing today. So this is a call to a RESTful web service that is actually part of the RESTful web service that we're going to be developing today. Again, I'm just going to do a GET request. So I'm going to paste in the URL, HTTP localhost web server complete. So I'm talking to something on my IIS locally, /API/employee/department/sales. So I'm drilling into my employee controller in terminology that we'll learn about in a little while. I'm asking for employees whose department is sales. Okay, so I'm making an application call to my web service. There's no other requirements to do this simple GET request, so we'll just hit send, and there's the response we got back in its raw view. Let's look at the pretty view. Oh, it's JSON. Okay, so the call took 759 milliseconds. What do we got in headers? Content length is 12,560 bytes of data came back. Content type is application JSON. Again, by default, Web API indicates that things are non-cacheable. If you want things to be cacheable, you step in and provide those headers and say, oh, it's valid for 6 hours or whatever it is you want to do. So there's an example of using Postman to make a simple call to a RESTful web service, and you can see the data that came back. Actually, I shouldn't do this, because I haven't tested this morning, but if we do this, so that did basically I'll talk to you about this later. Base address is just a variable that's defined in my Postman environment, and it allows me to switch between multiple environments that I've got defined. So if I do web demo complete, it's that localhost web demo complete URL. I'm talking to the local IIS server, which worked and came back in 23 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, and so on. If I talk to Azure Demo Cloud, send, it's calling an instance of the exact same web service that's out in Microsoft's Azure Cloud. Okay? It's been deployed to there, and it is talking to an instance of XF Server that's sitting in an Ubuntu Linux box that's also in the Azure Cloud. Okay, so we just talk to the exact same service out on the internet. And I'm pretty impressed that it's coming back with that response in 100 and so milliseconds. That's pretty good. Anyway, we digress. So that's just an example of how to interact with, or a basic interaction of a RESTful web service using a tool like this. By the way, as I mentioned a minute ago, if we go back to the original URL, let me just grab it again. Another way we can do this, of course, is we could just go to a browser and paste in the URL. Because again, it's a simple GET request. So that works equally as well. I don't have to use Postman. I can debug or I can test GET requests in any environment. You'll notice, I'm not sure why this happens. I think it's something Chrome does. You'll notice I'm getting XML back, not JSON now. And I think Chrome is sending a preference for XML. I think that's why that's happening, because Web API itself generally defaults to JSON. And I haven't specified here. So that always happens when I call it in Chrome. I always get XML. I never really did get to the bottom of it. But essentially, you can see that's the XML version of the same thing. There's my matching employee data whose department is sales. And clearly, what we're doing here is passing in data through the URL. So if we were to change this to something else like QA, I think there's a QA department, then we get employees who are in the QA department, and that's a different piece of data. Okay.